In the first part of this chapter, we talked about conducting research, collecting data, and how we might draw conclusions from the data we've collected. But we haven't really talked about how we actually go about collecting that data. On the next two slides, we're going to talk about some common data collection techniques that you might encounter in the field of psychology. So the first of these is direct observation. This is basically where you watch and record the behavior of your subjects as objectively and precisely as possible. This could be something like sitting in a room with a clipboard and making notes on what people do. Or it could be something like using a video camera to record someone's behavior and documenting it later on. Questionnaires are also fairly common in psychology. These tend to be a series of written questions designed to obtain information about people's attitudes, opinions, and specific aspects of behavior. So you might ask people how often they do a particular behavior, or what they believe about a particular concept. So this is obviously only going to work for humans because you need to be able to ask those questions and receive a response in some meaningful fashion. We also have sort of a related concept with the interview, which is kind of like a questionnaire, but it's conducted using face-to-face dialogue or over the phone, basically where you ask the questions out loud and make note of their responses. The next technique that we can look at would be a psychological test. So these are pretty general. This is going to be some kind of standardized measure that you want to use to obtain a sample of the subject's behavior. Two very common examples of psychological tests include IQ tests and personality tests. Basically, they ask questions in such a way as to try and determine something about either your intelligence or your personality. So it's a standardized measure. They're usually set up to have a predictable average within a population or something like that. And everyone will answer either the same or similar questions so that you can compare between different individuals who have taken the same test. So if you have the same IQ test from the same source, then you can compare intelligence quotients between individuals. Next, we can talk about physiological or neural recording, which is basically when you have an instrument that directly monitors and records some kind of specific physiological process within your subject. So maybe you want to measure heart rate, or maybe you want to measure skin conductance, or something like that. That would be a physiological recording. For the neural side of things, in different species, you can occasionally use things like single neuron recording. So you can look at how a single cell is behaving when it's active, when it fires, and then figure out what's going on from when it is versus is not active. This would also include techniques like brain scans and all sorts of different things. And then the last of our types of data collection techniques are something that's often overlooked, and this is the examination of archival records. Basically, when you go back and look at existing institutional records to see if there's any useful information that you might be able to use in a study. This is particularly important for things like correlational research, where you're trying to look at connections between different concepts. So archival records are sometimes a very useful source of information, especially in psychology. Now, from what we've talked about already in this chapter, you might have figured out that not all research is going to be experimental. There is, in fact, another category or another type of research study that can be conducted, and all of these sort of fall under the broad category of descriptive methods. So we have descriptive research or correlational research, depending on your source, which is basically where we want to capture, report, record, or otherwise describe a group. So we're trying to describe with descriptive methods. So this can include things like naturalistic observation, participant observation, case studies, and surveys. So notably, these descriptive methods, or this correlational research, doesn't involve manipulating variables. So it doesn't involve conducting actual experiments because you're not changing any factors. You're just observing and describing to see if you can understand the relationship between different things. So we're going to look at each of these types of descriptive methods, starting with naturalistic observation. So for naturalistic observation, you observe behavior without any kind of manipulation. It's called naturalistic because you tend to observe your subjects in nature. So you would find them in their natural habitat and observe their behavior there. This is beneficial because naturalistic observation is most likely to be representative of the behavior they'd exhibit in the real world because you're observing them in the real world. An example of naturalistic observation would be something like Jane Goodall observing apes in the wild. So going to where they are and watching them behave naturally in their natural environment. Now, the benefits there are great. You get to see that representative real-world behavior, but we do have to consider the downsides of this. So the cons of naturalistic behavior include the fact that we have no control over that behavior. So you can't get them to do a particular action, you just have to wait for things to happen. It's also very difficult to determine the exact cause of a behavior because you're not experimentally manipulating that situation. So we can't make any causal conclusions. We also need to keep in mind things like demand characteristics, where people will display different behavior as soon as they know they're being observed. So you can see things like reactivity, where people will change their behavior as soon as they know that they're being observed. Naturalistic observation also doesn't work for all kinds of behavior. It's really hard to study things that people rarely do using naturalistic observation because it's something that doesn't happen very often, and therefore it's very unlikely to see it. So it can require long periods of observation in order to get a single measure of your desired behavior. And that's sort of the last problem here with naturalistic observation, is it's very, very time consuming. I suppose the final thing is, if you were setting up to do naturalistic observation in a way that your subjects don't know that they're being recorded or watched, that can also run into some ethical issues because we need to have informed consent, especially with human participants. So we'll come back to that and the ethical ramifications of things towards the end of this chapter. Our next kind of observation is participant observation. And this is actually fairly similar to naturalistic observation. Sometimes it gets lumped in together. But in this situation, instead of just observing your population of interest, participant observation stresses that the researcher interacts with the population of interest. So they would join with the group that they're investigating and become part of that group. This should allow researchers to gain insight from the participants' perspective because they become part of this group. So this is common for things like understanding a political group or maybe people in a cult or in a particular culture. Researchers can go and integrate themselves into that way of life and gain insight from being part of those groups. Of course, we must also consider the limitations here. There may be some issues with biases or things are subject to interpretation of the researcher. Because the researcher is experiencing it with all of their own previous experience, there are those biases that can exist. And sometimes the observations that the researcher makes in that setting may not be repeatable. So they might encounter something once, but those exact same conditions will never come together again, so they might not be able to document it a second time. So it's all very things are going to happen as they happen because of the nature of this kind of study. The next kind of study is a case study. And these are fairly interesting. They are in-depth looks at a single person, a single group, or a single situation. So we typically think of case studies as getting a lot of information, of studying in depth a single individual. But this can also be sort of a little bit broader than that. So maybe there was a freak occurrence where something happened once and it's never happened again. So a case study could involve talking to all of the people who encountered or experienced that one strange situation. Or maybe we encounter a group, maybe a group that's been isolated from contact to the rest of humankind, and we want to get to know that specific group in more detail. That would still be considered a case study. So it's not just a single person, but it can be a single group or a single situation that we want to study more in depth. The benefits with case studies is that we tend to get a lot of detail, and we tend to be able to get lots of detail about very strange situations. So we tend to study people who have had very odd things happen or who have very extreme cases of particular disorders in order to learn more about it. But again, we need to keep in mind some of the limitations here. A case study is not an experiment. We're not manipulating things. We're still in that descriptive phase. So we can't draw any conclusions about causal relationships because we're not manipulating things. We also need to keep in mind that even though we can learn a lot of information about one individual, we may not be able to generalize our findings to a larger group. So you can think of a case study as looking at an N of one. So looking at a single subject or a single group or a single situation. We don't know if what we're seeing in this one particular instance is going to be the same in all other instances. We only have one piece of data that we've collected, so we can't generalize broadly without assuming quite a bit of error. And because a lot of these case studies are done where a single researcher or a group of researchers will work very closely with one person or one group of people, we tend to see some researcher bias because they're working so closely. So we have to be careful about things like that. For an example of our case study, we'll actually talk about quite a few case studies throughout this course, but one of the most famous ones is patient HM, who we now know as Henry Molaison. So you might notice that with a lot of case studies, they'll be named simply by their initials or by letters, something that keeps their identity relatively secret. But enough time has passed that Henry Molaison's name has been released. As a brief overview of HM as a case study, Henry Molaison suffered from epileptic seizures, and these seizures were very detrimental to his health and well-being. So his doctors decided to remove his hippocampus. So you can see on the slide here, we have a normal brain, which has all of that sort of brain matter in the middle, but in HM, this hippocampus area was removed. This process ended up solving his problem with epileptic seizures, but it came with the added side effect of experiencing anterograde amnesia, meaning that he couldn't form any new memories after the procedure had been performed. So this allowed researchers to gain more sort of information and better understand how the formation of memories happened, because removing this part of the brain interfered with the formation of new memories. So again, with all of those things we need to consider, we can't necessarily generalize across all human beings, but this did give us a good idea of where to start looking for future research when we wanted to get into studies of memory. Now, the last type of descriptive research that we're going to talk about are surveys. And surveys are pretty common. You've probably done a couple of them in your lifetime. So surveys are questions that are specifically designed to extract information from a group of people. So you might ask questions about what they think about certain topics, or how often they do a particular behavior, or basically anything that you want to know about. The benefit of surveys is that it's relatively easy to administer, so it's quite a cost-effective way to gather lots of information from a broad group of people. Because you can mail out, or nowadays you can email people and send them to a website and get them to complete a survey fairly quickly and easily. However, for our cons towards surveys, the surveys themselves are very susceptible to biases. We have lots of issues that can arise either on the researcher side or on the participant side. So we need to keep in mind things like, is there a bias in who actually completes the survey? So if you sent out a survey that asked people, do you complete online surveys? And everybody responds yes, well, that doesn't really tell you anything, does it? Because the people who would have responded no don't respond to online surveys. So you have to think sort of critically about what kind of information is being collected and how it's being collected. We also have biases like how questions are asked. So people will answer in a way that makes them sort of sound better or not look as bad. And researchers can bias participants by asking questions in a very particular way or leading them to give certain answers. So these are all things that we need to be very critically aware of if using surveys.